Hi everybody, I have a daughter who is away at college, and while she's not living here with us, I'd like to be able to use her room here for other activities. You see, I like to learn new stuff and I like to try new hobbies. While she's not here, maybe I'll work on myself a little bit and try taking up yoga. Ow! Or maybe not. Or maybe I could express my more creative side and take up painting. Hey Bob, what do you think? How am I doing? And you know, I've always wanted to try learning to play the trumpet. But apparently, so has my dog. Anyway, this is always going to be my daughter's room, and we'd like her to be as comfortable as possible when she comes home to visit. We'd also like to be able to use this room as a guest room, though, when she's not here. And most of our guests come in pairs, so the twin-size bed that was in here when this was my daughter's bedroom was really not going to be big enough for most of our guests' needs. So we decided to put in a queen-size Murphy bed so that we could both use this room for other things when guests weren't here, but also turn it right back into a bedroom really quickly when we needed it. When contemplating this project, I first looked into simply buying a pre-manufactured Murphy bed, but I could not believe just how expensive they are. Now I figured I could save a lot of money by just building one of these myself. Now I recognize this means it's going to take me a lot more time because those pre-manufactured kits, they're so expensive because they save you a whole lot of time. And I won't lie, this did take a long time to build. But I didn't mind exchanging some of my time for that savings. Plus it let me be able to customize this bed to be exactly what I wanted rather than being a kit that was kind of close but not quite exactly what we were looking for. Now the difficult part about building a bed like this is not any of the carpentry or the cabinetry work or even building the frame that the bed sits on, but rather it's figuring out the mechanism for both lowering and raising the bed back up. I didn't want to try and mess with figuring that out on my own, and the kits that are out there available with the hardware that you need are really affordable. So after some research into the different options that are available, I settled on a kit from Create-A-Bed. Now to be clear, this video is not sponsored or endorsed in any way by Create-A-Bed. I bought this kit with my own money because I believe it to be the highest quality kit at the right price point. There are lots of similar kits on the market. If you're interested in building a Murphy bed like this, I recommend you look at all the options before choosing a kit, but I've been happy with this kit from Create-A-Bed. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to see the exact kit that I bought. This kit comes with all the Murphy bed specific hardware you'll need, as well as excellent instructions for all of the phases of construction, including materials and cut lists, as well as templates for some of the trickier parts of the build. Here are some shots of the final result. As you can see, I was able to integrate this bed into this room so it matches the rest of the house, and it feels when you walk in here an awful lot like it's just a cabinet on the wall. Opening and closing it can be done with just one hand, and it's very quick to both set it up for use or to put it back away when you're done. I also added some extra touches like these integrated LED lights that can serve as a reading light at night or add some extra fun to the mood of the room. I'll come back to some more finished results later on in this video, but for now, let's get into this build. Now, as I'm recording this, lumber prices are very high, and as a result, the materials for this bed cost nearly triple what they would have around 3 or 4 years ago. However, lumber prices fluctuate, and I expect that prices will come back down. Now, with lumber prices as high as there are, I did not save as much money on this build as I was hoping. I did wind up spending about $700 or so for everything. However, that's still an awful lot cheaper than buying one of the pre-made kits. As I mentioned before, the instructions which come with this bed are really good, and they suggest several different options for how to finish out the cabinet. I decided to adapt their design to fit better with the aesthetic of our home, and I developed my own cabinet design and trim in Tinkercad, which is a free online 3D design tool, and I'll leave a link to that down below. This is my final design, and I used the measurements from this model along with the existing cut lists from the instructions to figure out exactly what I needed to buy as far as lumber goes for this project. With all my materials ready to go, I started the build. This begins with breaking down all the large sheets of lumber into a more manageable size and bringing things down to the correct dimensions based on the plans. I'll point out that you should do as I say and not as I do in these shots. I'm wearing gloves while using a table saw, and this is a bad idea, and I really should have known better. Don't wear gloves like I am here. One quick tip I'll share is as you're cutting out these pieces, they're all designated with a letter in the plan. So this is piece letter J, and I just wrote that on there with a very light pencil so it doesn't dent the wood. And that'll make it easier to determine which piece is what when you've later got just a big pile of pre-cut pieces. I like to use pencil, and I like to do it very lightly. I'm not going to be staining this, I'm going to be painting, so this won't really affect that at all. If you're going to be staining, you may want to consider some other way to mark your things, maybe with a sticker that's easy to peel off so that you don't damage or mar the surface. There are quite a few cuts to make to break down all the lumber. Be careful, take your time, and double check your measurements before cutting to make sure that you get things right. I found that the measurements for this bed are not very forgiving at all, so you need to be as precise as possible. All right, quick note on safety. 4x8 sheets of plywood that are 3/4 inches thick are quite heavy and they're bulky. They're difficult to move around for one person. And I happen to have a bum shoulder today, so I'm not super comfortable putting this through my table saw, especially because my table saw is really just a light duty saw. And for one person to push a piece like this through it is kind of right at the limits of where this saw is safe in the first place. So a couple options here. I could use a circular saw like this to simply mark my wood and cut as straight as possible, and that would work just fine. But in this case today, I have a neighbor who's agreed to come over and give me a hand, so I'm going to give him a call, and then I'll have an extra set of hands to put this through the table saw safely. With these plans, there are lots of opportunities to be efficient. One such technique I like to use is when I need to make a bunch of the same size piece, I'll very carefully measure and cut the first piece, then just use that as a template to mark and cut the rest of the pieces to match. This saves a lot of measuring time and results in nice uniformity between all of the matching pieces. With the lumber all broken down, I could begin assembly. With these plans, that starts with the ribs, which will be sandwiched between the plywood to provide the surface for the mattress. I was careful to be generous with both the glue and the screws, as this is the most load-bearing part of the build. I also countersunk all the screws to make sure they would not cause any uneven fit on the plywood. With the ribs assembled, I then attached them to the sides that form the inner guts of the frame. It's important when attaching these pieces that you make sure each rib is square. Again, measure carefully and make sure that you space them correctly. The instructions recommended doing this step on the ground, but I found that using my small assembly table with some clamps worked really well to keep the work at a comfortable height and save me a lot of crawling around on my old man knees. Up next is construction of the two long sides of the bed known as the rails. The instructions come with really helpful templates that are already printed at the correct dimensions. These are designed to be cut out and used as a guide for marking and cutting the side rails. If you don't have a bandsaw, a jigsaw or coping saw works great for all of the round cuts on this build. And I'm also using a drill press here, but a handheld drill will work just fine as well. We'll temporarily attach the legs to the rails, paying close attention to the orientation in the instructions. It's easy to mix up which leg goes on which side or to install them upside down. Start by screwing in the two small black screws on the long side closest to the curve, which then allows you to use the bracket as a template to drill holes for the other hardware. But I don't want anything to tear out of the back side of that hole as I'm drilling. So I'm going to take a piece of scrap wood that I have left over from when I cut everything for this bed, and I'm just going to clamp it to the back side, and this will prevent any tear out from happening. Make sure you clamp it pretty tight. Okay, now we can drill all the way through. And we should have nice clean holes on the back side. Yeah, looks fine. Into those holes we've got these posts. They will come through from the bottom side, and then the machine screws will go through from the top. Doing the test fit for the other side is basically the same, except it is a mirror image. So where I put the black screws in what was the top of the last one from my orientation and where I'm standing, the black screws are going to go in the bottom this time. Just remember that the black screws go on the side that has the curve cut into it, and the silver ones with the threaded posts are going to go on the other side. Here's how things look with the legs attached on both rails. Now we can move on to installing this plate with the ball stud on it. This is where the gas shock attaches to the rail at the head of the bed, and it bears all of the weight of the cantilever system as you fold and unfold the bed. The exact placement of this part is very important, so again, make sure to carefully follow the included template and the diagram measurements. I found that the template for this part was not quite printed to scale correctly, so triple check all your measurements. Now the instructions have this little 5/16 gap here, and they say it's easiest to go ahead and cut a little 5/16 spacer that will go between the ball and the top edge of the wood here. So I'll make a 5/16 spacer, and that's what we'll use for lining this up. That spacer just gets placed along the top edge of the board so that the ball from this is going to touch that spacer. That's going to space the ball up the correct amount from the top of the side rail. And when we do that, you can see then we're gonna key off of these two rear holes because you want this to overhang about 1/4 inch or so. Once we have this lower plate placed perfectly, we're ready to put in the screws, but it's really important the screws go into the center of their template holes so they don't pull that template out of place at all. I'll drill pilot holes for both of the two holes closest to the edge of the board. I'm gonna put one screw in, and then I'm gonna get my square, and I'll place the square along this bottom edge to square this up straight. Then once everything is square, I can use the other holes as guides to drill pilot holes for the rest of the fasteners, again using a backing board to avoid tear out. With all the holes drilled, next we'll test fit all the fasteners, paying close attention to which ones go where. Then we'll double check that everything is square and spaced correctly. And our spacing is still the 5/16. That's just perfect right in there. Then repeat this whole process for the other side, which is just a mirror of the first one. Next, we'll measure and mark the hole for the pivot hardware on both sides of the bed, and it's very important to get this placed exactly correctly, so double check your measurements before drilling. When drilling large holes like this, to avoid tearing out large chunks on the back side just as I finish the hole, I like to drill about halfway through and then flip the board over and finish the hole from the other side. This leaves two nice clean edges. Once the holes are drilled, drill pilot holes for and attach the pivot hardware. Next, we'll turn our attention to assembling the bed frame. We'll start by attaching the head rail to the frame, and the instructions did not specifically say how far to space out the screws, so I just went about 8 inches or so. I used the same spacing for the screws when I attached the foot rail next. Attaching the side rails follows nearly the same pattern, though in this case the instructions mentioned to add at least 2 screws between each strut. Once I had the side rails on, I ran into an error in my measurement. Now, nobody's perfect, and I like to include my mistakes in build videos like this so that you can learn how to deal with similar mistakes if they come up for you. Both the head and foot rails were cut on the wrong side of the line, leaving about the width of a saw blade or the kerf as a gap. To fill this, I grabbed a few pieces of cut-offs and sandwiched them into the crack. This filled the gap nicely and blended in well with the plywood. I'll note that this gap is not structural and will be both caulked and painted at a later stage, so I just needed to fill the void. With all the rails attached, I could move on to sanding a few key areas. I started by sanding the radius of the corners to make them a nice and smooth curve. One good way to do this is to wrap your sandpaper around a piece of scrap wood, which will help make sure you are applying even pressure across the edge that you're sanding. It also makes it easier to adjust high spots with even more leverage and control of the sandpaper. I then removed some of the hardware so I could reach everywhere, and finished sanding off the rest of the rail edges. I started sanding here so that I could next install edge banding. Edge banding is of course completely optional and is merely decorative. It usually comes in a big roll, and you just unroll the length that you need, then use an iron to heat the banding, which melts the glue pre-installed on the back side. Take your time on this step, and make sure you get all the glue to melt and stick down well. The banding is sized to have just a very slight overhang when you use plywood like this, and removing this overhang can be done in a variety of ways. You can just sand it off, or you could trim it by hand with a razor blade, or you can use a tool like this to shave the edges down to be perfectly flush with the sides. To use this tool, you just place the tool over the edge, squeeze, and pull it along. It leaves a practically perfect edge, which is finished off with a very light sanding to blend the corners in. I love using edge banding on projects like this, as it's a bit of a cheat code to make plywood look like it's actually a solid board. Now we're ready to attach the face panels. I didn't want to mar these panels on the floor, so I placed some scrap pieces under them. I then laid them side by side in a couple of different positions to try to get the grain and faces to match, as this is a surface which will be visible on the final project. Once I was happy with the positions of the face panels, following the instructions, I marked a line 1/4 inch in from the edge along both of the long edges. We'll use this line to center up the bed frame on the front face and to check for square. And in fact, as I laid the frame on the face panels, I discovered that the frame was not quite square. To fix this, I put one screw into the frame at one corner, then pulled the frame in line with the edge along the foot rail. Then I placed a few screws along that edge to hold it in place. Next, moving up to the head rail, I shifted it over so that the entire frame was square with the front panels, then placed another couple screws to hold it. Having those guidelines placed along the edges really helped me make sure everything was squared up correctly, though I'll point out that this is just a temporary assembly. I needed to get things lined up so that I could mark the outlines of where the slats were to prepare for gluing. Once the slats were marked, I pulled the screws back out of the frame and removed it so I could lay down beads of glue. Then I could finally assemble the frame and the front panels. As before, we'll start by screwing in first one corner, then we'll line up the bottom edge and screw that one down. Then we'll square up the head and make sure that the entire frame is perfectly square before finishing off the screws around the rest of the perimeter. Now we're ready to build the cabinet that will house the bed on the wall. As with the bed frame, the plans have clear instructions. Now some of the holes that you'll drill will require a very specific depth. This is easy to do with a drill press, but if you don't have a drill press, here's a quick tip. Measure the depth that you need on your drill bit and place a piece of tape on it, leaving a flap sticking out to one side. This makes it really easy to tell when you get to the correct depth. Just stop when the flap comes even with the surface that you're drilling into. One other note, the plate where the gas shock will attach is mounted with the black screws in the upper and the lower holes, but a threaded insert needs to line up with the center hole. These center inserts are not very forgiving, so it's important to get this lined up exactly perfectly. The recess you drill per the instructions underneath the ball location provides a lot of slop, so getting this positioned exactly right can be a little bit tricky. Here's how I did it. Use a square to line it up perfectly, then mark and drill the location for the threaded post first. Once that's in place, screw the screw into the threaded insert, but leave it a little bit loose. Then use the square again to make sure everything is squared up, and then you can install the black screws. This should result in a perfect alignment of everything, including that threaded post. The rest of the hardware on the side rail is pretty straightforward to install. Just be very careful to make sure that you measure accurately, as the position of all these components is critical to the bed folding correctly. Once everything's been installed on the sides, take it all back out. So far, most of our assembly has just been a pre-assembly to make sure that everything would fit correctly. It all has to be removed now for painting and finishing the sides. Just as with the bed frame, I used edge banding on the sides to dress up their edges. A bit of masking tape really helps to hold down the end of the edge banding, so you can iron it on in the right position. Just remember to come back once the band is mostly in place and remove that masking tape so you can iron down the ends. Next, I built the upper part of the box. This is the cross piece that will stretch from the two legs across the top of the bed. This piece involves some pretty easily confusing overlaps of things. So pay very careful attention to the plans to make sure you don't accidentally build it with some of the pieces maybe in the wrong orientation or lined up along the wrong edge of something. Don't ask me how I know. Okay, fine. Yes, I did have to build this thing twice because I assembled it sort of backwards the first time. With all the major components built, next I could go back to the bed box to finish off all the edges. Here are some more detailed shots showing how to install edge banding, and I think it's a super satisfying result. Now, like everybody, I really hate sanding, so I'll just mention here that I sanded everything, and I mean everything, starting with 120 grit and then 220 grit to prep it for paint. Make sure you wear respiratory protection when you're sanding like this. With all the dreaded sanding out of the way, I could put on a coat of primer. Then I caulked any edges or corners that needed a little bit of dressing up. Make sure that any caulk you use is both paintable and flexible like this one. Here you can see what a difference a little bit of caulk makes to the finished look of the bed. Then I added several coats of paint to all the exposed surfaces. A small finish roller made surprisingly quick work of this job, and I was really happy with how the paint turned out. The last thing the instructions tell you to do before finally installing this thing is to add the fold-down foot to the base. Then, with the help of my wife, I moved everything into the room to get it installed. The installation is a little bit complex. First, lay out all the pieces of the cabinet around the frame and assemble the cabinet on the ground. Make sure you remember to put this small ring in place over the post on the side of the cabinet. Then slide that post all the way until it is seated fully into the side of the bed frame. This whole assembly is then locked into place with these clips, and a pair of pliers is really handy for getting these installed correctly. Make sure the clip is fully seated, like this. There's one small variation I did for this install. The instructions would have you install the headboard flat against the back wall, but I wanted a little bit of rake in mine. Luckily, since I have both a baseboard and a chair rail on the wall, the headboard could be installed at a slight rake as long as it allowed the top to extend beyond the back of the frame just a little bit. I double checked all my measurements to make sure the mattress would still fit and clear everything when folding, and I'm happy with the results. But again, this is a variation on the instructions, and if your wall is flat and you don't have baseboard and chair rail like I do, you won't be able to do it this way. One other tricky thing to point out here, if you lay the top cross piece down on a carpet next to the sides of the frame and just screw them together, they likely won't line up correctly. The side piece will tend to sink down into the carpet more and you'll wind up with the top being offset a little bit. So the instructions say to lift up these side pieces now, but I'm not ready to do that because I would much rather put this header on while it's on the ground. It's far easier to do it that way. However, the instructions are very, very clear. You need to make sure this back face and this edge are exactly flush. And when they're laying on the ground like this, especially on a carpeted surface, you can see they're off by at least a 1/16 of an inch or so. So I'm going to be very careful when I put these screws in to flush these up before I do that. You want to make sure that this face and this face are perfectly flush, and this face and this face are perfectly flush. So I'm going to do that now. For all of the assembly, pay very close attention to these sorts of little details, and things should go together just fine. With the cabinet completed and the frame installed on the pivot, we could then rotate the cabinet up to the wall, leaving the frame down on the ground. And this is where I discovered one mistake that I made during the build. At this point, it's useful to reiterate that the instructions say to follow them very, very specifically, and I didn't. So here's what I have to do now. I put these bed stops in before I brought all of the pieces in, and in order to install the gas struts, those can't be there. So I'm gonna have to take those back out. Then we can put the struts in, and then I'll put them back on. With the stoppers removed, I could then walk the whole assembly away from the wall with a helper. Then I followed the instructions for installing the gas struts. Okay, with a helper, holding the bed frame in, notice that it is pulled in about 3 inches or so. I'm going to attach the gas shock. The shock is clearly marked with the end that goes up, and that's going to go on this top bar, but the instructions say to mount the bottom one first, and that goes right down there. And it just clips right on pretty easily. With the bed folded back, this gas shock should just clip straight onto this ball. Just like that. Okay, the gas shocks are now installed. With the bed still pulled away from the wall, you can install, or as in my case, reinstall, the bumpers so that the bed stops flush with the front of the cabinet. Now is also a great time to measure for and install some handles to use to operate the bed. This is also a good time to point out that the instructions leave it entirely up to you to decide how you'd like to finish off the front of the cabinet. For instance, I'm putting 2 handles in, but you don't have to. You could just put one in the center if you prefer. We just sort of eyeballed where we thought the handles looked good, and that's where we put them in. With the handles installed, we were ready to move the bed back against the wall to its permanent install location and attach the top of the cabinet to the wall. Make sure when doing this part that you accurately find studs behind the install location, as the top of the cabinet must be securely attached to studs. This is super important. This bed will rip right out of the wall if you don't get it installed to studs. And in fact, for my particular situation, I had one additional thing to do. So because of the extra spacing I have back up at the top up here that's caused by the chair rail that I have lower down, I'm installing this extra piece of backing wood. I've measured carefully where my studs are and put the first screw in here. Now I'm making sure that this wood is perfectly level. I'll go ahead and put another screw in at the other end where I've marked the rest of my studs. I'll make sure this is into the studs, and then the top of the bed will go into this piece of wood and into the studs. Then fold the bed open and have somebody sit at the end of it so it doesn't just flip closed. With someone sitting there, it will stay open so that you can then install the base that the mattress will lay on. And don't forget the mattress retention straps at the bottom corners. That's where the instructions end. Toss a mattress on there and the bed is now completely functional. But for me, it still needs some finish work. To help the bed look more integrated with the design of the rest of the room, I added trim around the top, along the bottom, and in a wainscot pattern across the front and sides. For all of these pieces, there was a fair bit of measuring, cutting things just a little bit large, test fitting, trimming, and then finally permanently installing. One thing to keep in mind if you install anything on the front face of this cabinet, if it's near the bottom, you'll likely need to shave down the lower edge so that it clears when you fold down the bed. Once everything was attached, I went over all the trim with a little bit of sandpaper to make sure everything was nice and smooth, rounded off any corners that were a little bit sharp, I filled in all the nail holes and gaps with some caulk, and then finally finished it off with several coats of paint. I also added a few extra touches like the LED lights that I mentioned at the beginning of the video and added some nightstands on either side with some charging stations that would be useful for our guests. All right, well, that's it. That's how I built this Murphy bed. I'm really happy with the results, and I hope you enjoyed watching the process as I built it. Hey, if you did, you can always hit that thumbs up button down below. That lets me know I'm doing a good job and tells YouTube I'm doing the same as well. If you had any comments or suggestions for things I could have done differently or better, I'd love to hear about that down in the comments section. And if you want to see more content like this, of course, you can always think about subscribing, but there's never any pressure from me on that, of course. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I'm gonna pass out. Yeah.